So I'm going to now turn over the podium to Adi Abulafia, who is just an absolutely incredible intellect and a gifted surgeon, and he's going to show us a really exciting case coming up right now.
Thank you, Mike. So my first case, so it's a 24-year-old female, and she presented to our clinic with bilateral idiopathic microspherophakia. Both her lenses were dislocated anteriorly with shallow anterior chambers, and as a consequence, she suffered from chronic angle closure. She was treated with glaucoma drops, BD, and her IOP was 18 millimeters of mercury in both of her eyes. Now, her best corrected distant visual acuity was 20/30 in both eyes. She had a myopic refraction and a significant corneal astigmatism. So my question to you is, what would you recommend for this patient? A, observation, keep the patient on topical glaucoma treatment. B, use peripheral laser trabeculoplasty in order to try to open the angle. C, perform a clear lens extraction, leave the patient aphakic and advise her to wear contact lenses. Or D, perform a clear lens extraction with an IOL implantation.
Everybody's voting, right?
Yeah. Okay, great. So D, it was my choice as well. So let's move to the next question, please. Okay, so you have another question now. Bearing in mind that you chose to do a clear lens extraction with an IOL implantation, what would you recommend for this? It's not.
Can we move
to
the next question?
Can we move to number 2? Yeah. Which IOL would you choose for this patient? Would you do an anterior chamber IOL? Would you do a scleral fixation IOL? Or would you preserve the bag using either a ring or a segment or the ASIA anchor, whatever you use in your OR, with a standard IOL, and the same thing but using a toric IOL? What did you choose, Mike?
I think I would choose the same way the audience did. We got a great audience here. Wow, you guys are awesome.
Okay, so great, thank you. Can we proceed with the presentation, please? Okay, great. So our treatment plan for this patient was to try and to reconstruct her anterior chambers, and by performing a clear lens extraction, preserving the bag with the help of a CTR and 2 capsular segments, and implanting toric IOLs and trying to aim for moderate monovision. So these are the lens tower printouts. These are the baratory calculator, and we chose a 3 diopter of a cylinder correction for her right eye and 2.25 correction for the left eye. And this is a short movie of one of her surgeries. You can see that the lens is anteriorly subluxated. The capsular axis is quite challenging due to the laxity of the zonals and the high elasticity of the capsule in this young patient. Then manual aspiration of the lens under anterior chamber maintainer. I'm inserting capsular hooks to stabilize the bag before inserting a capsular tension ring. Then the first segment is being prepared. I'm using Gore-Tex suture to fixate it to the sclera. So I'm externalizing the ends of the suture, and the suture is being tied. This is the second segment, so it's the same. The knots are being buried within the sclera. And now that we have a new bag in a new position, we are implanting a toric lens through a 2.4 millimeters clear corneal incision, and I'm aligning the toric IOL using a digital marking system. Just one iteration at the end of the surgery. And this is how she looked following the surgery. And you can see in retroillumination the 2 segments at 6 and 12 o'clock. Okay, so these are the Scheimpflug images of the patients before the surgery, and you can appreciate the same Scheimpflug images after the surgery. Both her anterior chambers were deep, and the IOP dropped down to 14 with no need for any IOP-lowering drugs. Now, regarding her vision, her right eye, her uncorrected distant visual acuity was 20/15, and for the left eye, uncorrected intermediate visual acuity was 20/20, and her refraction was for the right eye planar with -1/4 at 150, and for the left eye, -3/4 and -3/4 of SIL at 175, and she's very happy. So, should I move?
That's just an absolutely superb result and a fabulous case, and I think that it's an important testament to keep in mind that, you know, just because we're going to be fixating the capsular bag, once the bag is fixated, I think it's great to be able to use a toric implant lens and correct the astigmatism. Once the bag is stable, the toric component should be no different than a regular case, so bravo.
Thank you. I had some luck as well. You always need it. The next case is about a 66-year-old female. She has cataract, myopia, and with the rule astigmatism. And we have all these measurements, including the total corneal measurements by 2 devices. And my question to you is, how will you consider the posterior corneal astigmatism in this toric IOL calculation? A, would you use the standard keratometry values? The posterior cornea in this case will not make a big difference. B, use a mathematical model like the Barrett or the Abulafia Koch. C, use direct measurements of the total corneal astigmatism. Or D, use intraoperative refractive biometry. Mike?
Well, this is going to be an interesting one. I'm curious what the audience is going to pick, because I think there may be a lot of spread.
Okay, good. I'm happy with A. It's only 3%. Okay. So can we move forward? Well, okay. So we know today that standard keratometry and topography machines tend to yield inaccurate results in assessing the total corneal astigmatic power. What they do, they measure the anterior corneal curvature, and they assume that there's a fixed ratio between the anterior and the posterior surfaces of the cornea, which we know today that it's not correct. Now, basically, 2 solutions have been taken to address this issue. The first one is the use of mathematical model, which estimate the total corneal astigmatism based on anterior corneal measurements and direct measurements of the posterior cornea. Well, we know today that if we ignore the posterior corneal astigmatism effect, it will typically lead to against-the-rule errors in the predicted refractive astigmatism, whereas applying a mathematical model reduces these prediction errors dramatically. Now, direct measurements of the posterior cornea should actually be the gold standard. But if we look at the current literature, it seems that at least at the moment, some of the mathematical models are more accurate than direct measurements of the posterior cornea. Nevertheless, you have to remember to be careful when using the mathematical models. You should never use them with total corneal measurements, because then you are going to correct the same problem twice and you are going to get it wrong. Another issue is do not rely on the mathematical models for the unusual corneas, because they were not designed to account for that. So let's go back to our patient. We have these LensTower printouts. So these are the toric calculators. We have the Barrett that suggests for this patient a T7. We have the Heel RBF, that's T8. We have the Olson suggests the T9. Now, I implanted for this lady an Alcon lens, so we can go to the Alcon website, and you can choose there either to use the Barrett one, you can use the Barrett formula. It will give you the same result as the one that you have on the LensTower, just without the spherical equivalent prediction. Or you can use the Holiday option, which is a standard toric calculator that doesn't take into account the posterior cornea, and for this patient, it will suggest to use a T9. What about the total corneal refractive power? Can we use the Scheimpflug measurements for this patient? Well, not with the Barrett. Remember, if you will enter that in the Barrett calculator, you are going to account for the same problem twice and you are going to get it wrong. So you can use that, but then you need to use the Holiday 1 option, a standard toric calculator, and it suggests the T9 in this case. What about web source OCT? Total keratometry, same thing as for the Scheimpflug. You cannot use it with the Barrett. If you want to use it, use the Holiday option, and here it will suggest the T9. So this lady had an eventful cataract extraction with a T8 implantation. Her post-op refraction was +1/4 with no sill and with a good uncorrected distant visual acuity. And if we look at the errors in the predicted refractive astigmatism, we can see that the mathematical models had the best prediction as regard to all the other methods that we examined. Thank you.
Adi, that was just a beautiful talk, and I think it's so important. Adi always emphasizes how important it is to look at the data, right? There's all kinds of really cool technologies, and some of the technologies can be very seductive, but at the end of the day, we always want to look at the data and see what are the best results that we can get. So we're going to do another slit lamp fun image here. And I'm just going to point out, when I look at slit lamp images, there's a couple of things that I view. One is, what is this? This is the reflex of the mirror off of the slit lamp, and we can see that this reflex is nice and sharp. So even without focusing on the surface of the cornea, we know that the tear film is quite good. We know that the cornea is relatively clear and that there's not any central irregular astigmatism. We've got a pretty darn good focus. We can see that this is the diffuse illuminator, and we're focused on the plane of roughly the iris and the capsule. And then there's this thing over here. So our next audience response question is, what is this? Is this a traumatic foreign body? Is this a photoshopped artifact that I put in? I might do something like that. Is this one of the faculty's babies? Is this a useful tool for dialysis? Is it letters C and D? So we'll go into our audience response question, and you all have 10 seconds to make your pick. What will it be? So now everybody has to vote. Those of you who aren't voting, you got to vote. 2 seconds left. The suspense is killing me. And we had a bunch of people pick D, and we had a bunch of people pick E. And sure enough, you're all right. So we're going to go back into the presentations. This is actually letters C and D. This is an ASI anchor. This was designed by Dr. Asia, and it is a really wonderful tool for zonular dialysis, and it's his baby, so I think that does make E correct. And he's going to show us some really cool stuff, but I do want to talk to you about the anchor because he's not going to show us that yet. This case was done under FDA compassionate use device exemption. We don't have the device yet here in the States. Just in case you're curious how this works, the outer two arms are actually within the capsular bag, and they're tented around the capsulorhexis margin there. The central portion sits in front of the capsular bag, and the part that's hidden behind the iris in the capsular bag is outlined in red, and the rest of it that's behind the iris and the ciliary sulcus is blue, and then it's fixated to the scleral wall with a suture going through there. So it's a really wonderful creative device that just about everybody in the world except for us can use, and hopefully one day we'll get one of these here in the States too. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Asia, who is one of the most creative and innovative minds on the planet, and he's going to show us a couple of really interesting cases, some of which might not have specific answers, but are great starting points for discussion. Ehud?